Hello. On behalf of the History Department, I'm very pleased to welcome you here, all of you, this afternoon. My name is Emilio Curí. I'm the chair of the department. I'm really very happy to inaugurate today the department's John Hope Franklin Lectures. They honor the legacy in this university and far, far beyond of John Hope Franklin, one of the towering scholars who developed the field of African American history in this country and beyond. Franklin taught at the University of Chicago. Some people don't know or certainly don't remember. From 1964 until 1982. And during those years, he laid the groundwork for what I and many others regard as the department's ongoing commitment to research and teaching on the history of slavery and its afterlives. A number of very distinguished scholars, colleagues of ours, among them Tom Holt and Julie Saville, have in the intervening years followed in those footsteps, and several others who are now members of the faculty are very much part of that tradition. Now, with these lectures that begin today, and we hope go far, far, far into the future, the department reaffirms this commitment precisely as it seeks to renew its faculty with a new generation of scholars committed to the pursuit of those kinds of inquiries. The lecture series will focus broadly, as the title says, on slavery and its afterlives, the African diaspora, and matters related to race, slavery, emancipation, and the meanings of freedom, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, in connection with the afterlives of slavery. We are fortunate, and that's why I think all of you are here, to have two terrific historians, Jennifer Morgan and Vincent Brown, visiting the university as our inaugural lecturers. I just wish to thank the organizing committee, the Social Sciences Division, the Race Center, and the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor Fund for helping us to make this happen. I think, and I thank you all for being here in what I feel and hope is very much an auspicious beginning to a department tradition. Thank you all for being here, and with that, I just want to introduce my colleague, John Levy, who will present the first speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Emilio. I want to echo your gratitude and thanks to all the sponsors of this event. I also want to, in particular, express my gratitude to Natalie Barton, a PhD student in the history department and a member of the committee that organized this series for her efforts. It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Jennifer Morgan is professor at New York University in the Department of History and also the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, of which she currently serves as chair. Professor Morgan, who received her PhD in history from Duke University, is a leading historian of early America, of African American history, of comparative slavery, and of women's history. She's also no less an important feminist theorist. And indeed, one of the unique qualities of her scholarship is its combination of archival historical research with conceptual and methodological reflection and also inventiveness. Morgan is the author of Laboring Women, Gender and Reproduction in New World Slavery. It's a book that's been excerpted and reprinted in multiple volumes ever since its publication. And I'd like to read one short sentence from Laboring Women that has always struck me. I'm quoting, "Women's lives under slavery in the Americas always included the possibilities of their wombs." Now, as wide-ranging as Morgan's scholarship has always been, spanning issues of law, labor, race, demography, and economy, this penetrating insight of her scholarship, much because of her influence, has become foundational to the study of racial slavery as a field. As Morgan also wrote in Laboring Women, quote, "Centering the lives of enslaved women is not simply an exercise of inclusion, but is rather a foundational methodology in writing the history of America." And I very much think of that as John Hope Franklin's legacy, not simply a matter of inclusion, but reworking the foundations of our scholarship. Among other recent projects, Professor Morgan is now at the final stages of publishing a new book on the simultaneous birth of economic rationality and the familial intimacies of racial slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. It calls for and executes what she calls a new political economy of women in early modern slavery. And I expect when it's published soon, it will transform how historians conceptualize and write about the history of slavery and its afterlives, but also more generally write about the economy. Her title this afternoon is Madwoman on the Slave Ship, Reproduction and Racial Capitalism. Please welcome Jennifer Morgan.
That was such a moving introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you to John Levy, to Brody Fisher, to Dustin Jenkins, and to Amy Drew Stanley for inviting me, and to Cindy Breshock for all the logistical work of getting both me and Professor Brown here. It's an enormous honor for me to be here, to be here at the University of Chicago, but also to inaugurate this series that is in homage to John Hope Franklin. When Professor Franklin left the University of Chicago in 1982, he came to Duke. Now, by the time I got to Duke, Dr. Franklin was emeritus there. He wasn't teaching, but he was always around and he was always encouraging when we were lucky enough to cross paths. I was maybe a little bit luckier than other people in my cohort because my great aunt Margaret was friendly with Miss Aurelia and shared John Hope's passion for orchids. And I milked that connection with him whenever I saw him. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm just a little nervous. So what I'm doing today is something that is a step away from the way that I usually give a talk, because what I'm trying to do is step back from the archive just a little bit. And as John said, I'm just finished a new book project, and I want to share with you all the kind of conceptual framing of the book, some of the big questions that I'm asking, with a little nod to the archive here and there. And I'm happy to talk more about the archive as we move forward. So in 1675, the English captain of the slave ship James made a note in his logbook concerning the fate of one of the female captives on board. He wrote, being very fond of her child, carrying her up and down, wore her to nothing, by which means she fell into a fever and died. And actually, just today, I was looking at that quote and realized that I don't know if it's the child who died or if it's the mother. I have to go back, but in either way, this is an appropriate epitaph for this paper. So I'm going to start with talking about phantasms. At the heart of Atlantic slavery, there is a very simple proposition that women and men purchased in African markets would produce commodities for sale in European markets. They were a predictable investment. Even in a landscape of precarity, an investment that could reap returns both during and after the life of the enslaved worker, especially should that worker give birth to children. A buyer of human property marked in this fashion could rest easy that their investment would return profits and could be passed down to their own progeny, a hope that was often undone by premature death, but one that provided a structure on which the institution of racial slavery could rest. In this way, slave ownership and the heritability of enslavement produced speculative possibility, boundless estates, and expanded wealth for generations. An economically rational proposition, this is. But as Michelle Murphy has recently argued about 20th century GDP data, the economic rationality that attached to slave-based economic projections might usefully be considered phantasmograms, quantitative practices that are enriched with affect, propagate imaginaries, lure feelings, and hence have supernatural effects in surplus of their rational precepts. Racial slavery became a foundation upon which all matter of things could be built, both real and imaginary, both tangible and phantasmagorical. The wealth was real, as were the financial risks. The phantasms were the idea of slave ownership without entanglement or culpability, the notion of the happy slave, the stupid slave, the loyal slave, the endless returns on investments, the gentle Christian slave owner, the fecund and fertile enslaved woman. The reproductive capacity of enslaved women is at the heart of this fantasy. The appropriation of Black future through the transformation of enslaved women into generative forms of capital became the ideological foundation of hereditary racial slavery. Futurity was gendered. As slave regimes developed, they did so by legally separating childbearing from kinship. They structured women's bodies at the center of a bare genealogy in which, as literary scholar Nancy Bentley has argued, kinlessness operates to make the facts of the body serve the socio-political order of New World slave societies. By providing a context through which the economization of the enslaved made moral and economic sense, it rendered hereditary enslavable legible. It, meaning kinlessness, rendered hereditary enslavement legible to both slave owners and the enslaved. Slavery is built on kinship and kinlessness. It destroys, exploits, and remakes kinship among the enslaved, such that kinlessness subtended enslavement. So, kinship. Durkheim said of kinship that it is a social tie or it is nothing. Kinship may reference procreation, but it is embedded in social life. It is the process by which people create interdependence. Marshall Sahlins concluded rather poetically that kinship is a mutuality of being, and that kinfolks are persons who belong to one another, who are members of one another. Less poetically, we know that kinship and kinlessness yield definitions and strategies for governance, for settlement and colonization, for domination and regulation that are all embedded in notions of race and racial hierarchy. I reference Durkheim's nothing with the word kinlessness, meant to indicate not an ontological state, but rather a castigation, the charge from European travelers, slave traders, and slave owners that Africans produced only procreative ties, that they had no capacity to belong to one another. Kinship becomes key to enslaved persons' efforts to endure enslavement and to identify slavery's core violations. The novelist Nathaniel McKay says that the relationship between Africa and America is an assertion of broken claims of connection, defined by the ruptures of maternal estrangement that he names wounded kinship. In the pens of the formerly enslaved, kinship became a crucial space from which to launch a relentless critique of racial slavery. Whether it was in Harriet Jacobs' 7-year-long domestic exile to a 3-foot-tall crawl space in her grandmother's attic, secretly watching over her children while simultaneously escaping the efforts of her owner to father more, or in Frederick Douglass's lament that his mother had many children, but that he had no family. Formerly enslaved people very clearly unpacked the meaning of wounded kinship, the discovery that your family ties were illusory and the assertion that they were not. So the evocation of kinship by 19th century abolitionists like Douglass and Harriet Jacobs cements family as a key index of the immoral horrors of slavery, both for what slavery did to black families and for what it did to white families, but that is a story for another time. But the problem of kinship in regards to the business of slavery enters the records much earlier than the 19th century. And it is in relation to the business of slavery that kinlessness acquires its most pointed analytic potency. Early modern European travelers and slave traders constructed stories of rulers with massive harems, of women who abandoned children rather than impede their tribal wars, of childbirth as neither private nor painful, of incest and the free giving of wives and daughters as tokens of friendship to European adventurers. They remarked on affective ties even as they mounted a systematic hierarchy organized on the refusal that such ties existed. Their stories were of sexual depravity and bodily strangeness that testified to the absence of legible family forms. Kinship was thus weaponized to define Africans as debased and to rationalize the debasement through the language of what Hortense Spillers labeled absent structures of family feeling. So slave traders and slave owners across the Atlantic world erected ideological scaffolds on which they could legitimately consign African women and men to the living death of enslavement. In regards to the way they discussed and depicted women, that scaffold took the form of disavowal, claims that women were without pain, without purity, without sensation, and without kin, that they bred children like livestock on the West African coast and relinquished them with disinterest in the Americas. And those sentiments have often been mobilized by historians, including myself, to talk about prejudice and about the sort of origins of racial prejudice. But rather than clustering them primarily on the balance sheet of prejudice, in this larger project in here today, I want to situate those damning proclamations as in the rationalizing account books of capitalism. The acts of instantiating kinlessness onto Africans and their descendants were embedded in the turn to the modern, to capitalism, and to the liberal individuation of the universal subject. That early scaffold cast long shadows on our archives, archives that routinely segregate family and culture from business and economy. And for slave buyers and slave traders who left the records on which our history depended, it was but for slave buyers and slave traders who left those records, it was imperative to obscure the degree to which they used the bodies of enslaved women to both define enslavability and to demarcate their own personhood. So this is the archive that I'm entangled in. It's an archive problem that's essentially an effort to exhume the women who comprised upwards of 40% of those transported in the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean in the first 200 years of the slave trade, and to extricate them from the ideological morass that threatens enduring obscurity. European slavers and buyers were nonplussed when faced with the prospect of extracting hard labor from these women, and yet the archival traces of their existence are spotty and paltry. Finding them is an archive problem that is ubiquitous for scholars of slavery and gender, but it also carries with it some very particular challenges for the early modern period, embedded as it is in the problem of knowledge production, the knowledge that defines both the discipline of history and the phantasmograms of early modern economies. In the 17th century emergence of empiricism, obviously, so much has been lost. I began a project of accounting for them, and this book for a long time was called Accounting for the Women in Slavery, and then someone else wrote that, used that title, who will remain nameless. So I began a project of accounting for them, an effort to just know how many women were transported before 1700, and ended up chasing apparitions, haunted by the functionality of the presumption that women were of no importance in the construction of early modern capitalism, convinced that it is here in the interstices between the accusation of irrelevance and the powerful evidence to the contrary that something of profound importance is revealed. Africans, of course, had to be constantly made into slaves. African women came to signify something more than just the hard labor they performed. They performed sexual labor too, of course, but it is in their reproductive capacities and possibilities that they marked the economic logics of race and hereditary racial slavery. The unwillingness on the part of contemporary traders, purchasers, legislators, and the like to record the presence of these women is a problem of knowledge formation as much as it is a problem of structural violence. So what can we learn about racial capitalism's relationship to kinship from the women from the woman whose subjugation is rooted in the claim that she produces nothing other than bare life, a claim thrust upon her aboard a slave ship as she descends into madness and death with her child clutched in her arms. The ability to translate or convert biology into affect is what makes us human. To build an economy on the claim that such a capacity was only the province of the few was an astonishing feat of violence. As Saidiya Hartman has written, hereditary racial slavery made the mark of the mother a death sentence for her child. It turned the act of birth into an act of death, the birth canal into a middle passage. I can't restore this woman who I open with to history, and I'm cognizant of the empty romance that would be encoded in such a gesture. All of us who know the problem of Venus, the problem of the black wench, are attentive to those reviolations. But my sojourn in the archive is an attempt to put flesh and blood on the apparition of the madwoman on board the slave ship so as to understand the overlap between her death and the birth of capitalist modernity. So much, though not all, of the vibrant work on slavery and capitalism that is pulling our field into new directions is explicitly engaged with Cedric Robinson. Robinson introduced the concept of racial capitalism in 1983 in Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition. There, he argued that the conditions from which early capitalism developed required the pre-existence of ideas of human hierarchy that would subsequently be captured under the nomenclature of race. Through such a lens, the existence of slavery at the onset of early modern capitalist formations is neither coincidence nor incidental. The capitalism, which he terms racial capitalism to capture this process, depended on violence, on imperialism, and of course on slavery. He mounted his evidence about the concurrence of race and capitalism using the reorganization of labor practices predicated on ideas of ethnic or regional particularity in medieval Europe, or on what he called antagonistic differences directed at racialized subjects such as Jews, the Irish, Slavs, Roma, and others. So Robinson situates racial capitalism at the emergence of modernity, demanding a reconsideration of the categories that attend it, beginning with capitalism, but including secularism, individualism, new ways of writing and thinking and enacting governance, all of the phenomena as understood to signal modern. Race is thus entwined with the very forces of knowledge production that enable us to ask questions about change over time to begin with. As Pablo Gomez has recently argued in his study of healing and knowledge formation in the 16th and 17th century Caribbean, we need to be able to step outside of the structures of meaning that have defined our fields of inquiry in order to see how the thought processes and inspirations of those propelled into the Black Atlantic both were framed and reframed by what became the modern. In my work, it means asking how, for enslaved women in the 17th century, the presumption that they were kinless got folded into the explanation for why they are so hard to find. So, when enslaved women are at the core of the way we understand both the history of slavery and its reverberative afterlives, many things are revealed. At the start, it is the impossibility of thinking race in the absence of women's reproductive capacities. But historians of racial ideology haven't always considered such connections. Kathy Brown inaugurates that work on sort of moving the history of the origin of the idea of race into a new direction. The fundamental characteristic of race as an organizing concept, of course, is that it is a visible inheritance, that the body carries within and upon it the evidence of its genealogy. As the logic of race began to cohere around the business of the transatlantic slave trade, that which the body carried became fundamentally attached to economic future as well, to the capacity of the slave owner to own both people and their progeny in perpetuity. The capacity to imagine an Atlantic future upon which wealth is produced through the laborers marked as such by their racial inheritance depends, therefore, on the repudiation, on the mobilization of and the repudiation of kinship, on the claim that African women only had the capacity for reproduction stripped of social meaning. Explicitly or implicitly, recognizing African women, men, and children as members of families, as humans defined by their location in kin networks, was dangerous. It would threaten the phantasmagram on which a massive economy was being constructed. Atlantic racial slavery mobilized kinship and heritability even as it produced human racial formation, and thus it compels us to carefully consider the ways in which reproduction is intimately tied to the history of racial capitalism. Rationalizing the sale and distribution of human beings demanded the suppression of kinship to the arithmetic of the marketplace. The accusations and logics mobilized under the rubric of racialist ideology and rooted in the refusal of kin ties were crucial to that suppression. The work of race as an organizing concept of labor, hierarchy, and colonial extraction drew, of course, on concepts of culture and prejudice to give it legs. But in our attention to and debates around the role of culture and religion as the fertile ground for racial prejudice to take roots, we've sometimes ignored both the marketplace and women's role in producing the marketplace as such. Not, mind you, the influence of economics as a coherent field that fuels the turn to slave labor. Winthrop Jordan famously posited in 1968 that the move to chattel slavery in Virginia was an unthinking decision, predicated on a racism that made the turn to black slaves easy when the need for new labor compelled it. But the way that the Atlantic marketplace is itself coeval with forced labor, that economy and economic rationality emerge as conceptual frames alongside the notion of extractable and heritable marked categories of labor, this still demands our attention. The transformation of sovereign people into slaves took place in the context of emerging landscapes of economic gain well before Virginia planters meandered towards slavery. To imagine that such a conversion was simply a manifestation of European prejudice is to situate the move itself as affect rather than calculus. If we presume that Europeans simply felt that Africans should be enslaved, and to locate that feeling only in animus, or fear, or the illogic of religious prejudice, we fail to understand where racial slavery was situated and how it got there. It reflects and refracts older notions of the other rooted in religion, language, wealth, and sovereignty, certainly. But it adheres to enslaved men and women so as to produce a seemingly infinite pool of laborers, a continent full of nothing more than Moors, blacks, and slaves. In the travel narratives of the 16th and 17th century, European writers position African women as vectors of overabundant chaos. They are part of what defines Africans as indistinguishable populations, fungible, unregulated, and outside of kinship. So, what are the implications of situating the rationalizing logic of racial slavery in proximity to both kinship and its disavowal? What does it require of slave owners, and what does it instantiate in the enslaved? As Robin Blackburn argued more than 15 years ago, in the laboratory that was the 16th century Caribbean, the fact that enslaved people had both the capacity and the legal route to claim freedom and form families was widely understood. Women and men born on the West and West Central African coasts maintained their linguistic and community-based identities for decades in Latin America and the Caribbean, sometimes obtaining their freedom, always mounting irrefutable arguments about their dispossession through their presence in and recrafting of Catholicism, the market, craft works, healing arts, the production of families through formal and informal marriages. In other words, 16th century slave owners bore witness to the production of kinship and community formation among Africans and their descendants, irregardless of the claims that had been lobbed at Africans by European travelers. They inhabited communities characterized by proximity and intimacy between indigenous people, Africans and Europeans, and were marked by the Creole languages, belief systems, and bodies that testified to the multiple exchanges that were possible between and across disparate peoples. So what had to change? How were Africans made slaves? Claims about indelible difference began to emerge alongside of incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. Because the slave trade was inaugurating something quite new, something rooted in finance, commerce, economy, and empire in ways not seen before, and thus in ways that required entirely new formulations, the organizing principles of intimacy and economy could only come together in the interstices of knowing and not knowing, in the contradictory spaces in which claims that Africans weren't human occupied the exact same space as profoundly human interactions, communicating, copulating, and the like. It was not always this way. For those watching the rationalities of racial slavery, hold on, there we go. For those watching the rationalities of racial slavery cohere, even from the relative safety, for example, of the Portuguese court, the transformation was at times quite jarring. The enormity of the violation that was taking place was sometimes impossible to suppress. In the 15th century, for Zurara, the royal chronicler to King Afonso V, the inherent viciousness of this manner of human calculus was not entirely lost. He described the arrival of what we now understand to be the first voyage of a slave ship from the African coast to the European market in 1444. And as the 250 African captives were unloaded on the docks, he described their grief. And he says, we could not understand the words of their language, but the sound of it right well accorded with the measure of their sadness. To increase their suffering still more, there now arrived those who had charge of the division of the captives, and who began to separate one from the other in order to make an equal partition, and then was it needful to separate fathers from sons, husbands from wives, mothers from children. Zurara's language, division, equal partitions, in contrast to the language of family, fathers, mothers, sons, and wives, conveys the essential conflict enacted by hereditary slavery, that between market and kin. For Zurara, the pathos of enslavement was best evoked by the contrast between the divisional rationality of distributed merchandise and a mother's willingness to sacrifice herself in an effort to protect her child. His language marks the crucial problem space. But this episode is an interruption. In a volume of more than 150 modern pages, the emphasis is primarily on the Portuguese successes and failures in capturing Africans, and their descriptions occur throughout with neither empathy or pathos. Still, in the starkest possible terms, Zurara and his readers saw the challenge posed by human cargo to those attempting to situate them as commodities in a market. How to instantiate the logics of commerce into the affective space of kinship. Even more importantly, they saw the efforts of those men and women to reject this process. These things happen always at the same time. To interrupt their commodification through a refusal to remain categorized in equal partitions. Fathers and sons, or wives and husbands, mothers and children, refusing to be separated, holding on to one another, disrupting the partition, and, as the inevitable occurred, wailing out their protests. These relationships were clearly visible to the onlookers on the port, and they were irrefutably essential to the captives. So I am, of course, primarily interested in what being barred from kinship meant for women. I want to unearth and convey something of the material contours of their lives, but there is something more. There's a conviction, there's my conviction, that by looking with them, we can discern something that has eluded us. At the risk of stating the obvious, how can we possibly understand a labor system harnessed to the inherited mark of racial dispossession without clarifying how those closest to its inheritance were positioned? As I have said, in the aggregate, women were outnumbered in the transatlantic slave trade by men and children. But in the first 2 centuries of the trade, women and men were relatively balanced among captives. New evidence that's coming in on the first waves of slave trading to Spanish America is particularly important for the study of gender and slavery, as all extant evidence points to the fact that more women were captured and sold to the Americas before 1700 than in later decades. And that's something that demographers know, and have known it for some time, but what hasn't happened is like a clear unpacking of what that means, that the definition of slavery and enslavement is about the work that women are doing alongside of men in significant numbers, not in little dribs and drabs, but in significant numbers. And one of the reasons I would argue that I started to go off script, so I'm going to go back to my script. So in the 16th century, for example, in 16th century Ecuador, records of slave sales indicate near equal numbers of men and women purchased to labor in the city of Quito, and broader population figures suggest at least 40% of enslaved Africans were female. In Lima, census and tax records put the population of Black and mulatto women at just over 50% by 1600. The presence of enslaved women was so ubiquitous there that, as historian Tamara Walker has shown, policing their movement and their garb became a crucial aspect of 17th century Spanish colonial law. There were female majorities on the island of Barbados for the entire period of slavery. There were near equal numbers of men and women. At times in South Carolina, there were female majorities in New York City among the enslaved. We see these all over. But we have unthought the role of these women in the birth of Atlantic slavery and in the meaning of their presence. The Slave Voyages database documents about 4,400 slave trading voyages from Africa to the Americas in the first period of the slave trade, so from 1514 to 1700. Understanding the demographic contours of the captives on board those ships is crucial to understanding how racial slavery evolved. And yet, and this is the piece that is sort of a turning point for me, less than 10% of those ship captains record sex ratios in the database. So that's a big part of the larger project. Like, what does it mean to see and not see? We know that those sex ratios are relatively balanced because of other kinds of records, but for ship captains, it's not uniformly important. Out of almost out of those 4,400 voyages, 10%, fewer than 10% contain information about the percentage of men and women on board those ships. We know, though, that when captains recorded sex ratio, 30% carried more adult women than men, 53% carried more females than males when you account for children, and the vast majority of ships where women are recorded do include children as well. So of 337 voyages in which sex ratio is recorded, 309 include age ratios as well. So in these early voyages, adult men were not in the majority, but evidentiary practices bleed into our historical narratives and rendering male majorities the norm and blurring the contours of women's lives. Europeans were quite familiar with enslaving women even prior to the turn to Africa. There was nothing particularly discomforting about the use of lesser statused women to provide hard labor for elite European households. I want to be clear here, I'm not making an argument about something that's very specific to, that's something that would sort of naturally impede Europeans from enslaving African women. We know that's not true, but we know it not just because of what happens with African women, but also because of what happened in Europe. From Italy to Iberia to England, women defined as different worked in European households and fields, laying the groundwork for the presumption that gendered notions of protection were only extended to women in the immediate families of property-owning men. But once the fixity of racial inheritance adhered to the concept of slave, something else changed. Enslaved women became erased from view. The presence of women among the captives in the inaugural shipments of enslaved Africans to Europe and then to the Americas was obvious. Our inability to see them, however, this blindness induced by the accounting practices of ship captains and slave owners alike, is imbued with meaning. Meaning linked to concepts of the fungible, the irrational, the quantifiable. European writers located the African continent through the alchemy of monstrosity, heathenism, and unregulated trade. The encounters are replete with women who mark the process of rendering Africa into a legitimate source of European plunder. Women's disordered presence did important work, distinguished them from more familiar European female forced laborers, and offered up a strategy for marketing a seemingly endless populace of African slaves. The capacity of enslaved women to convey enslavability to their children, and thus involuntarily to convey them to the market, this is where reproduction and racial capitalism intersect. The notion of enslavability was attached to the reproductive capacity of a woman perceived as fundamentally different from the household for which she labored, even as her sexual vulnerability to the slave owner testified to her sameness. It is that space of corporeal contradiction that I want us to think through, as it's precisely that space, I argue, that positions the Europeans who became slave traders, slave buyers, and slave owners to perceive African women and men as legitimate commodities, as fungible on the base of a mark of difference whose indelibility was nonetheless breachable. And the breachable has to do with sex and sexual violence. Many scholars of race in the early modern period, Cedric Robinson, Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Wynter, Kim Hall, Herman Bennett, among others, have explored the ways that racialized ideologies of difference in Europe are firmly tethered to the process by which Africans get sort of slotted into the category of the enslavable. Less attended, I think, is the precise work that the origin of the race reproduction bind performed in moving racial slavery into the heart of early modern capitalism. And the race reproduction bind is a phrase introduced by Elise Weinbaum, who's a contemporary theorist of reproduction, race, and the afterlife of slavery. So by this I mean we need to more capaciously consider the connection between women's reproductive capacities and the ability to both name and imagine race, and the work that that connection does to produce human beings as nothing more than enslavable. What emerged in the 16th and 17th century were new regimes of thought that displaced notions of complex communities with singular claims to racial clarity. Such claims served as cover for the contradictory violences that hereditary racial slavery inserted into colonial projects, and without which such projects would have been impossible. Let's return to the women forcibly separated from their children and spouses on the dock in 1444, to the woman who walks herself to death and madness. Their refusal to relinquish their kinship ties to the anonymizing record books and to the mathematical divisions of the slave traders suggests a foundational counter-narrative to commodification among the enslaved. For Robinson, the manifestation of Black radicalism, which is the core project that he was invested in, the manifestations of Black radicalism are based in a commitment on the part of the enslaved to rejecting the terms on which their captivity was founded, the preservation of an ontological totality, a sense of wholeness that he writes, quote, was not predicated on Africans' experience of plantation life, but on a total rejection of their lot. The Black radical tradition, he writes, cast doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture. This conviction that capitalism's penetration had limits in the lives of people whose labors produced capitalist economies is at the crux of the matter, both for Robinson and in my current work for myself. To me, it poses a still unanswered question. In the face of the captures, transports, and sales and imposed labor regimes that defined life for the African women who became the commodity form on which Atlantic economies were founded, where might ontological totality be found, much less preserved? As I look to the early colonial archives, what I find is a conceptual space in which we glimpse the roots of dissent, the nascent articulation of what will become a diasporic theory of power, a recognition on the part of the enslaved that the marketing of their bodies is nothing less than a systematic denial of their kinship ties, and as such must be refused. I see it in the action of women like Dorothy Angola and Maria Portuguese, who use the courts to try to place their children in indentureships after the Dutch West India Company used those children to hold their parents in a state of half freedom in colonial New York. I see it in the court case of Elizabeth Keyes, the daughter of an African woman and an Englishman who argued that she had inherited freedom from her father, even as the Virginia House of Burgesses moved to insist that children such as herself could only inherit enslavement from their mothers. And I see it in the ubiquitous growth of maroon communities across the West Indies and Latin America, where colonial governors attempted to situate maroon women only as themselves slaves of and victims of men, and never as maroons themselves. I'm suggesting that there is a corporeal foundation to both the recognition of the enormity of what racial slavery meant and to its refusal, one felt in the body, one viscerally accessed by enslaved and free Black women. I make this argument from a range of sources, those that describe women's capture and transport while pregnant, those, and here, I don't know if you've seen these before. This is an 1816 illustration, and I think you can see here, this is a woman giving birth on the ship. There's a person crouched between her legs, assisting at the birth. This is the slave ship Marie Seraphique, and there are women with children and pregnant women throughout the female section of the illustration. So this is not so there's images like that. Images that describe women's capture and transport while pregnant, those that describe women's use of the courts and the church to protect their children's future, those that recognize the internal growth of maroon villages, that maroon villages were spaces of reproduction and that children were being born there. It wasn't just growing from runaways. These bits of evidence are inadequate, of course, but they lead me to consider carefully the extent to which claims of natural dispossession rooted in the bodies of these women would be perceived by these women. It is a suggestion that builds on Robinson's notion of the desire for ontological totality, but that departs from it in crucial ways. For Robinson, the urge towards the rejection of enslavement was rooted in African culture and the maintenance of a sense of self across the Middle Passage that carried with it the urge and capacity to collectively reject enslavement entirely. These are the roots of Black radicalism, a clear rejection of racial capitalism, as it is a reclaiming of community for life outside of and opposed to the plantation and its attendant structures of domination and extraction. But what is this if not a reclamation of kinship? What racial capitalism does in its starkest terms is to introduce the human body to the marketplace. And thus, in its starkest terms, it situates African women at the heart of the structural logic of the business of slavery. This isn't a metaphor. African actual women are laboring throughout the Americas, and equally importantly, slave owners are conceiving of Black people as produced for markets. They did so alongside ample evidence that ship captains and crews and settlers in the Americas alike viewed enslaved African women as valid outlets for sexual release, and did so with a fairly clear understanding that children born from such actions would enlarge the slave owner's balance sheets, not his family. This, too, was something that accompanied the definitional logics of racial slavery, rather than preceded it. In 15th century Europe, enslaved women's labors routinely involved the expectation of sexual services, but the children of enslaved Berbers, Slavs, or Muslims were often understood as members of the slave owner's or father's family. This shifted with the imposition of race as the condition of enslavement. Africans were defined as unassimilable, even as the sexual services of enslaved women continued to be the burden of their condition. This reality is indeed part of what constitutes the racial mark of enslavability as early as the beginning of the 16th century. The disavowal of paternity, which is clearly linked to the inevitability of all Black women's children's exposure to the marketplace, made hereditary racial slavery legible. Women whose reproductive potential laid bare the racialized logic of hereditary and hierarchical claims to authority gained critical analysis not only through their proximity to marketplaces, but I argue through the ways that the market was made manifest through their body. So to end with Robinson, he wrote in another place that the conceit of a racial regime is a makeshift patchwork masquerading as memory and the immutable. Nevertheless, racial regimes do possess history, that is, histories that are discernible origins and mechanisms of assembly, but racial regimes are unrelentingly hostile to their exhibition. This antipathy exists because a discoverable history is incompatible with a racial regime and its claim of naturalism. But if the roots of racial capitalism are entwined in the emergence of the race reproduction bind and the harnessing of African women's reproductive capacities to the economies of the transatlantic slave trade, so then are the origins of the Black radical tradition. As Imani Perry suggests in Vexy Things, there are alternative grammars for liberation that are rooted in embodied truths. Those grammars are incompatible with claims of naturalism, even as they are formed in the corporeal earthiness of birth and death and the middle passages that relentlessly took place inside enslaved women's bodies. They are the grammars of sanity in the face of madness, in the refusal to relinquish a child to the market, a refusal felt so powerfully and clearly that it wore you down to nothing and left you dead with your claim to family and to kin clenched in your arms. Thank you.
Excellent. So we have some time for questions?
Yes.
Before we do that, a few quick notes. So first, when we finish, we'll have a reception just outside. Also, we'll be back here tomorrow at the same time, same place, for a lecture by Vincent Brown. And then third, Friday, different location, Classics 110, a roundtable from 10 a.m. Until noon, led by our very own Destin Jenkins. Okay, so questions. Are you okay calling?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, where's Natalie? Okay, I'm going to work this side of the room. You work this. Wait for the microphones because we're recording the Q&A session. So it'll come around after you're called. Please.
Thanks. That was a great lecture. You mentioned the term balance sheet. Mm-hmm. Were the prices for young females higher because of the potential?
Not systematically. If you account, so in the aggregate, men cost more than women. If you account for age, that imbalance evens out a little bit. So women who are defined as kind of as prime workers, I'm talking about like in the Sugar Islands, are often priced at about the same as men who are in that same category. But for the most part, they're not. They don't. They don't. Claim a larger value on balance sheets. They just do this thing, which I've talked about in the earlier book, which is kind of indicate a kind of speculative future. So in slave owners' wills, they will promise unborn children to their own children as a way to kind of expand the possibility of their wealth, right? And so that to me feels, it feels like this one of these places where the kind of rationality of economics and pricing kind of hits up against the irrationality of race and reproduction. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really great, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what you think your contributions to feminist theory might be, because obviously one strain of feminist theory has moved away from kinship, maybe towards sexuality. I think one of the most powerful parts of your argument, I'm a theorist, not a historian, so that's why I'm asking you about this, is I'd love to just hear you say more about what you think the critical purchose of thinking about kinship as a modern problem or category, and even though you might be using that in a more specific way than I'm thinking of it, are there permutations or iterations in late modernity? I mean, kinship seems to be having this ascendant role in.
I think that's a really good question, and I think I think another tension in the work that I'm doing is trying to kind of revisit this association of women with family, right, in a way that suggests that there's something different happening. And in fact, for me, it's raising questions for a next project that's about the history of the public-private split and the role of African and African-descendant people in creating the idea of private life for elite landed white families. So I think I've been really influenced by new feminist work on the idea of population and the way that population and kinship is used by the state. And so I think I think I'm extending that argument back. But I also feel like I'm on, like that I might be treading on some unstable ground in terms of my interest in kind of repositioning a kind of corporeal, bodily idea of reproductive futurity among these women as like the essential mode through which they're understanding their larger place in the world. So I recognize that. I feel like that's something I have to think a little bit more about. Thank you for the question. There's someone right here.
Hi, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how what you call the race reproduction bind varied across slave societies in the New World. And I know that conceptions of race varied, and of course, and actual reproduction rates varied. Did they vary together? Is there a sense in which that bind looks very different in different slave societies?
That's such a good question. So one of the things so the race reproduction bind, as I use it, and as I think Weinbaum uses it as well, is to talk about the fact that race actually is dependent on a reproductive body in order to make conceptual sense, like race as inheritance, race as hereditary, etc. I think that your question, so in that regard, I'm saying like this is the key way that we need to understand the emergence of the idea of race and of the heritability and sort of endless inheritability of enslavement in New World slavery. I think the other question, though, is do actual reproduction rates and the changes in those have changed the way that people are understanding the emergence of racial categories? And I think that I think I'm like the queen of yes and no, that in part, so part of what we know is that in places that are dominated by Catholicism and in Spanish, so in like early modern Spanish slave societies, there's a lot more room for kind of interracial, in the emergence of multiracial categories and the idea of enslaved people having a kind of natural right to obtain freedom, et cetera. And so that somehow race is less fixed a category, enslavement is less fixed of a category. But I think that the new work on early modern slavery in Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean is saying that it's not that it is less fixed, it's that it emerges in a slightly different form, and that the association of blackness with enslavability continues to be the case. And in the English Caribbean and the English colonies, what's fascinating to me is that the idea of this sort of racial futurity, the tapping into the reproductive future of an enslaved woman, is there regardless of actual reproduction rates. Like, in fact, it's only, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, it's only in the North American slave society context, for the most part, that reproduction rates are high enough that that the population is not dependent on the slave trade to be maintained or to grow. So this is it's all ideology, right? There are women who are having babies. There are slave owners who are selling women's children away from them, right? Like, those things are happening, but there's also this other register that I'm interested in, which is the way that the kind of imagined possibility of reproductive growth is part of what fuels the economy and the investment in slave labor as opposed to other kinds of labor. So, but I think it's a really good question that I don't have the answer to yet.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I'm curious about the absence of the notion of natal alienation in your talk, and I just wanted to ask you about how you're thinking natal alienation vis-a-vis the concept of kinshiplessness.
It's in the book, and it's and it's in dialogue with my colleague Vince Brown, who's helped me to think a lot about natal alienation to rethink the concept of natal alienation both with and past Patterson. So I think that part of what I'm doing is searching for a new way to talk about that process of kinlessness or rootlessness, which is obviously also what Patterson is talking about, right? I'm not just doing that because he's here, but one of the things that Brown does in his article on natal alienation and on Patterson and the concept of social death is talk about the condition, using the idea of the condition of natal alienation versus and now I've just lost your quote. Right, but that it's also that it's not a fixed condition, right? That there's something that's always pushed. You have a very good word. I'll figure it out. There you go, a receding horizon. Something that you're always that you're in tension with. And so when I'm trying to talk about that moment when an enslaved woman understands the economic structure that she's living in through her effort to try to keep her child out of the hands of a slave owner, that is for me an example of pushing past a kind of fixity of social death or natal alienation, and to say that may be how slave owners are thinking about why this person is enslavable, but that's not the way that person is understanding these constant claims on her, these constant rejection of her capacity to produce kinship, right? Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I really appreciate the time and especially just so many sentences that I was just madly writing down because you have a beautiful way of encapsulating things. I wanted to ask, I guess, two related questions that have to do with the relationship of your arguments across space and time, I guess, more than anything. And I guess the clearest way that I can phrase the question is to sort of present for you two situations that I'm having a hard time sort of squaring with the center of the argument about slavery and being in some sense the negation of kinship. The first would be a fairly empirical observation, I suppose, which is that especially in 19th century Brazilian slavery literature, which is what I know best, there's a lot of really interesting work about the use of family ties as a form of
control.
Well, as a way of perpetuating slavery, that it's used as a way of ensuring that people will be loyal, because if they're not, and loyal across the bounds of slavery, that is, even once people are freed, the idea of staying near their kin becomes a way to rope them into other forms of unfree labor that succeed the state of slavery. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about how that fits into the picture. And then the other is a more abstract idea that I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate well, but I guess it has to do with the notion of how we think about kinship itself, and particularly how we think about exploitation within the framework of kinship. And there are certainly places, and I think Brazil is again kind of a paradigm of this, where it's assumed that structures of kinship are also structures of violence and exploitation. That is, and kinship extends beyond blood, and it's very hierarchical. And so within that framework of kinship, it's not actually unnatural for slavery to exist and the abuses of slavery to exist, because it's seen as one extreme of a range of exploitative and violence practices that are expected to occur within these radically hierarchical structures, right? And so I'm also wondering how that conception of what kinship is about fits together with your ideas. Thank you.
So I think that, thank you so much. So part of what I'm trying to do is to locate this argument in the 16th and the 17th century, and to say that something is emerging about the way that that slavery and enslavement is rationalized, that depends on this this negation of, that depends on this claim that women only produce procreative and not kin ties. But there's no question that the other thing that, and it happens in North America, it happens in the English Atlantic, as well as in Brazil, is the use of kin ties as a means of social control. So I'm not at all saying that slave owners, that it stops there. I'm not, but I really appreciate what I'm saying is that what emerges, or what I'm asking is it possible that the way that kinship gets used as a form of social control and as a deeply hierarchical institution might also be shaped by the way that kinship emerges in the early modern, right? So that this might be a moment where we need to rethink that history of how kinship is used as as manifesting hierarchy, both in European descendant kin networks as well as in African or indigenous descendant kin networks. And that part of what slavery does, because racial slavery so saturates the Atlantic in presenting new ways to think about so many things, that it kind of snatches kinship up. So I think, though, that that I need to make it much clearer here that I've got these bookends. And I sort of, when I say that thing about 19th century abolitionists, right, and the way that like the affirmation of family is a crucial abolitionist romance, right, I'm sort of gesturing to that, like I know that other things are happening here, but I don't do it explicitly enough. So I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. First of all, Madwoman on a Slave Ship is much better than Accounting for Women in Slavery. Like it's a great title. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about the opening passage and the way where you found this, how you've been engaging with this, both when you originally encountered it and how your thoughts have changed over time on that particular passage. And then my second question is about maroon communities and how you're using maroons in this, in your larger project and in this book as being both similar to how how they are seen in reference to kinship, as well as being something different as outside of systems of racial slavery.
Right. So the way that I'll take the second question first, and then I'll go back to the opening passage. So for me, what's important about the maroon communities is I'm looking at them more from the perspective of colonial legislators and slave owners who are trying to control them, right, or who are forced into negotiations with them. And what you have there are these little, it's not a huge amount of discussion, but there's these moments in which women emerge, and it's always the accusation that maroons, who are by default men, are stealing and enslaving women from the plantations. So you get a way where women are referred to as bounty. So there'll be a list of things stolen from the plantation, food, and women. And then you also have evidence of women who run away to the maroon communities, right, and who bring, seeds and provisions with them. So what's interesting to me there is this. So when I talk about the way that slave owners and slave owning legislators see and don't see women, like that's a very good example. So they know that there are women working on plantations. They know that there are women in maroon communities, but they can't stop gendering maroons as only men, and they can't imagine, even as they describe community formation and family formation in maroon villages, they can't imagine that women are active participants in that process. So I do less of reading it from inside those communities. I'm more interested in the way that it's another example of the kind of refusal, that inability to hold, kinship and hierarchy and reproduction and slavery all in the same place. The notice of the woman who dies on board comes from a ship captain's log in 1675, and there are many of those logs are just sort of, capture and death rates on, today 4 women and 6 men came aboard, today 2 men died, 1 woman died. But every once in a while you have these more fulsome accounts. And when they concern women, they often also concern either sexual violence or pregnancy or child care. So like the discussion of a woman who is taking care of another person's child, the discussion of a woman who's raped brutally by a sailor, and the ship captain notes, if anything happens to her, I will take it out of his pay, and I know who she is because she was very pregnant when it happened, right? So there are these little eruptions, that's the only way I can describe them, in the logbooks of the ship captains that make you know that those women are often the sexual favors given to sailors, to the crew, and also that they are assigned to whatever child care functions might happen. The death of one woman and the child, or a woman who miscarries and her fetus is dead inside of her for some time. I mean, it's fairly brutal language as well. So what I noticed, though, and literally I noticed it today as I was like putting that pathetic little PowerPoint together, is that I need to go back to the original source beat to see if the captain says she died or it died. Do you see what I mean? Like, I've always read it as that she died, like that she walked herself to death, like to madness. But now I wonder if her madness was that she was clutching a dead child, right? So I think, so that's what I need to revisit and go back to the source. But I think either way, it's about madness. It's about the ship captain noting her madness and that he sees it. It's made visible to him through this unnatural attachment to a child. And the attachment to the child is unnatural, of course, because they're on board a slave ship. Right? Like that, if he had witnessed this in some other context, it would not be an unnatural thing for a mother to clutch an ill child. And you know what I'm saying? Like it's part of what happens is that we're seeing the kind of logics, the perverse and violating logics of the slave ship made manifest in these little kind of asides from the slave ship captains. Thank you.
I actually had a question about on the madness point and how to juxtapose and think it through in terms of economic rationality, because it does seem to be on the other kind of side of these tensions along with kinship and intimacy. But one could think about capitalism not just in the kind of Weberian instrumental rationality sense, but in the more speculative irrational sense, and thinking about this as an origin of that phenomenon. And then also thinking of another, maybe it's not the Black radical tradition, or maybe it's related to it, but another origin of a critique of capitalism as actually being not rational at all, but actually systemically irrational.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in the larger project, and I think I gesture towards here, is reminding us that racial slavery is wildly irrational, right? And it's an act of constant violation and re-violation and the framing that makes it rational is the profit that comes from it. But of course, the act of it is obscene, right? So I think that in that regard, this argument is very, even though you're right, because what I do is I kind of pose this sort of, these oppositions between kind of capitalist rationality, the ledger book, versus the kind of earthiness of a woman's experience. But I think that what I'm really saying is that this place of female enslavement is so foundational to what emerges, that then this can't remain rational. It can't remain sort of untouched by that. And in fact, what we have to see is that the things that many of my colleagues have been talking so carefully about, like the logic of the Ledger book, which is a cover for the violence of the plantation regime, right? It's an ideological tool that's not just about record keeping, it's about making this thing seem normal, which is not. So it has to circle back around on itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I had one question on sort of the public-private split and the domestic economy. So when I was listening to your talk, it kind of reminded me of the work of Thavolia Glimpf and also of Stephanie Jones-Rogers.
Yep.
Glimpf was also at Duke. And Stephanie Jones-Rogers.
Yes.
And they talk a lot about sort of not only the public-private split, which I guess is going to be in your next work, but also about sort of domesticity and like the way that does sort of intertwine with the public-private split and the domestic economy. And so I was wondering if you had sort of thoughts on the way that those three things are intertwined, because I think it kind of sort of weaves in all three of your projects in a way.
Yeah, no, and I mean, so the reason why I started thinking about this was from teaching Thavolia Glimpf's work, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is like what precedes the 19th century antebellum plantation house that produces the idea that somehow this is supposed to be a site of private domesticity or gentility or all of those things that get attached to it. And so what I'm interested in is thinking about this, this 17th century or early 18th century moment in which people are articulating these new ideas about domesticity and about and very gendered ideas about what women's work should be. And women's work is always a cover for a certain class of women, a certain race of women, et cetera. So I think that if I do take this up in the way that I imagine that I will, it's to be a kind of prequel to the work of Glimpf and Jones-Rogers, who are both very much interested in unpacking this idea of white female gentility inside the household, and saying that the household is both a space of profound violence and also violent production. So I think that their work is kind of predicated on a little bit, and I don't mean this to dismiss it at all, but like in a little bit of an aha, like, oh, you see, the plantation household is not that thing. And what I'm interested in is what creates the presumption that that thing should be that thing. And I think that the answer to that might be found a little earlier. Yeah.
So we have time for another question or two, or there's food outside and some stomachs are rumbling. We can
Some wine.
stop there. Does anybody like to ask another question?
It's all good.
Okay, let's stop there and thank you again.
Thank you.